Welcome to our review on the menstrual cycle. So first thing we need to know is what is the menstrual cycle, and hopefully a lot of you are actually sitting there knowing this already. The menstrual cycle is the monthly cycle that gets the body ready for a potential pregnancy. And this cycle is going to last around 28 days, but it does vary from individual to individual slightly. The first thing we really need to think about is what the female reproductive system actually looks like. So here's a diagram that you do need to be able to recognise and label, as well as knowing what each of those parts actually does. So first thing we've got the little bit sticking off the sides really that look like the ends of some weird little alien. Those are the ovaries, and that's where the eggs will mature. The bit in the middle, that's the uterus, and that's where the fetus is going to develop. At the bottom of the uterus you can see the cervix, which is the entrance to our uterus there. Beneath that is the vagina, which receives the sperm from the penis during sexual intercourse. And then the bit that connects the ovaries to the uterus there is the fallopian tube. So that's the site where the egg will be fertilised, assuming it's going to be fertilised, and then it continues travelling down the tube before implanting into the uterus. So what we actually find happening in the menstrual cycle is that each month the lining of the uterus starts to thicken, and the whole purpose behind that is to be ready just in case an egg is fertilised. So it's ready to receive it and provide the environment it needs to develop. At the same time that the lining of our uterus is thickening, then an egg starts to mature in one of the ovaries. About 14 days after the egg has started to mature, then it gets released from the ovary, and the point at which the egg is released is called ovulation. So the egg then travels down the fallopian tube, where if sperm is present, it will potentially be fertilised. It's not a guarantee, but potentially. And then if that egg is fertilised, it will implant into the uterus lining, where it's then protected and receives all the nutrients and oxygen it requires from the mother to allow it to develop. If the egg isn't fertilised, as is way more common, then what we find is the uterus lining will be removed from the body. So what we find there is we have this whole sloughing of the lining, and sloughing is a word we don't get to use enough, but the lining breaks down and is then lost from the body, and that is what the period actually is, or menstruation is. So this isn't just something that happens without any form of control. Your body actually controls this by using 4 hormones which are made in the pituitary gland and the ovaries. So we've got the follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH, we have estrogen, luteinizing hormone, or LH, and progesterone. The first hormone, FSH, or follicle stimulating hormone, this is secreted by the pituitary gland. From there it's going to travel through the bloodstream to the ovaries, and it's going to cause an egg to mature. At the same time, it's also going to stimulate the ovaries to produce a second hormone, which is estrogen. The second hormone that's really important in the menstrual cycle is estrogen. Now, estrogen is made and secreted by the ovaries, and it causes the uterus lining to thicken. Now, what we also see is that increasing estrogen levels in the blood will inhibit the production of FSH. So the whole purpose of that is to stop more than one egg from maturing, and that usually is the case. The other thing it's going to do is stimulate the pituitary gland to release LH, which is our third hormone in the cycle. LH, or luteinizing hormone, is secreted by the pituitary gland. And what we see is at that peak in the middle of the cycle where we've got those highest levels of LH, that is the point that ovulation is triggered. Our fourth and final hormone we need to know about is progesterone. So progesterone is going to maintain the uterus lining. So what we find is if you end up being pregnant, then the levels remain high throughout the pregnancy because it keeps the lining thick, which obviously means that the little developing embryo is going to have all of the nutrients and the oxygen it requires. As progesterone is also being produced, it's going to inhibit the production of LH as well. One of the things that they do like to ask you about when we're looking at questions on the menstrual cycle is this graph here. If you look at it, it's not as bad as it first looks because we can break it down into 4 individual graphs. So if we have a look at the top graph, we can see we've got the levels of FSH and LH. The second graph down is your estrogen level. Third one is progesterone. And then the bottom one is just showing what's happening to the uterus lining. So if we think back to what we said, first of all, about FSH, which was our first hormone in the cycle, then that one is going to actually cause an egg to mature and it's going to stimulate the ovaries to produce estrogen. So if we have a little look, we can see FSH is increasing right at the end or the very beginning of the new cycle. And as a result, we can see that we're getting that increase in estrogen. So follow the FSH up and then look down to the estrogen, you can see that one increases in turn. And then when we've got our estrogen, we can see that the lining is thickening, which is what we'd expect to see. So where the estrogen line goes up, have a look, the lining is also thicker. In terms of our progesterone on our third graph, you can see you've got that peak that coincides with the period where we've actually got the lining nice and thick and it's being maintained. So that is that middle block there between approximately days 16 and 26. So as long as our progesterone is high, then our lining is maintained. As soon as the progesterone levels drop, you can see that's the part where the lining starts to break down and then the actual menstruation part starts. So when you're given one of these graphs, don't just think, oh, I don't have a clue and turn over. Just have a look each one in turn and talk about what's happening. Link them together and then you'll be absolutely fine on that question. So hopefully at the end of this video you can recall the different hormones involved in the menstrual cycle and you can also explain where they're produced and what their role actually is.